A homeless veteran sits quietly on a rain-soaked bench, carrying nothing but a duffel and his dignity. Then a cop mocks him. In seconds, silence becomes stronger than authority. The crowd turns, and a badge falls in disgrace. But what began as cruelty on one city block spirals into a storm of outrage, justice, and redemption that no one saw coming. This isn't just about a man and his dog tags. It's about the power of quiet strength when the world demands noise. The city did not wake all at once. It stood in pieces, as though reluctant to admit the night was truly over. On the corner of Jefferson and Main, a neon sign above a diner sputtered twice before flickering off completely, surrendering its glow to the pale light that filtered down between buildings. Across the street, a liquor store's metal shutters rattled upward, inch by inch, the sound grating against the quiet stillness of early morning. The air was damp, heavy with the lingering scent of rain that had swept through in the night, leaving beads of water on every surface, puddles in the cracks of the pavement, droplets clinging stubbornly to rusted railings, a sheen on the asphalt that reflected the gray light like a film. The street belonged to no one for a few fragile minutes. A lone taxi idled near the curb, its driver slumped forward with his forehead against the steering wheel, trying to summon the strength for another day. Farther down, a bus hissed as its brakes released, the sound echoing against walls that had yet to warm with the noise of commerce. A few early risers appeared, a jogger in bright sneakers pounding lightly over the sidewalk, a sanitation worker dragging heavy bins across the alley mouth, a woman clutching a styrofoam cup of coffee, as though it alone kept her standing upright. They did not speak to one another. They rarely did. The ritual of the street at dawn was not in conversation, but in coexistence. Bodies moving in parallel lines, each carrying its own private urgency. Above them, gulls circled lazily, their cries sharp in the muted morning. The city was too far inland for them, really, but they had followed the rivers, the refuse, the endless scraps of life that human beings left behind. Their wings carved across the sky, flashes of white against the steel-gray canvas of clouds that hung low and heavy, threatening more rain before noon. A bus stop stood at the corner, its glass panels smeared with fingerprints and flyers taped in crooked stacks, ads for cheap rooms, promises of miracle weight loss pills, a missing cat with tired eyes. On the bench beneath, a man slept with his back pressed against the cool metal, his shape hunched and folded to fit into the narrow space. His coat was heavy, too heavy for the season, patched in places where the fabric had frayed. A canvas duffel bag rested at his feet, its seams stretched, its zippers dull with rust. No one looked at him directly. Some noticed, of course they always did, but noticing was not the same as seeing. Commuters trained themselves to pass without eye contact, to reduce him to part of the urban scenery, as unremarkable as the lamppost or the trash can beside him. The street hummed with small sounds, layered together, the shuffle of shoes on damp pavement, the hiss of bus doors, the faint thud of newspapers landing on stoops. Somewhere in the distance, a siren wailed, and then faded, swallowed by the maze of buildings. The world was alive but not yet fully awake, caught in the in-between space where silence still held some claim but routine was already pressing in. A bakery door opened, releasing a rush of warm air scented with yeast and sugar. The smell clung to the mist and drifted outward, making stomachs growl, drawing the eyes of workers trudging toward offices. A man on a bicycle rattled past, a stack of folded uniforms strapped to the rack behind him. He rang his bell once, a sharp chime that cut briefly through the fog. It was an ordinary street, ordinary in the way that 1,000 others were across the city. But there was a weight in the air that most people couldn't name, a subtle pull that made them glance once more at the man on the bench before turning away. They didn't know it yet, but this corner, this block waking under the gray dawn would not be remembered for the bakery or the neon diner, or for the way the rain smelled when it lingered on stone. It would be remembered because of what was about to happen, because of the small cruelty and the greater reckoning waiting to unfold. For now, though the city breathed steadily, like a body still half asleep, cars rolled slowly through green lights. Windows glowed faintly with television screens tuned to morning news. The sky hung low, painted in streaks of gold and ash, as if hesitating between storm and sunlight. And on the corner bench, the man shifted slightly, pulling his coat tighter around him, his eyes opening to the day with the same wariness and discipline he had carried through years no one else on this street would ever understand. The storm had not yet arrived, but dawn had delivered the stage. The man stirred long before the city truly noticed him. His movements were slow, deliberate, the kind of careful shifts made by someone used to conserving energy. His name, though no one on Jefferson and Main knew it, was William Hayes. To most, he was just another homeless man folded into the scenery of the city's early hours. But William carried more than worn fabric and weathered skin. He carried years. He carried battles. The bench beneath him was cold, even with the morning's dampness pressing up through layers of metal and bone. He adjusted himself against it, his spine stiff with the ache of nights spent outside. His coat was military issue, though faded now, its olive green washed into an almost gray by time and rain. The buttons were mismatched, the fabric patched in places where kind strangers, sometimes William himself with a dull needle, had tried to give it a second life. Beneath it, his shirt clung loosely, threadbare at the cuffs, and his boots told the story of too many miles walked without destination. At his feet sat a duffel bag, its canvas sagging under the weight of years. The bag had once been a soldier's lifeline, packed with rations and ammunition. But now it held different necessities: a folded blanket, a worn water bottle, a small notebook filled with uneven handwriting. In the side pocket rested a handful of photographs, creased and fading faces from another time, smiles that still shone despite the years. Tucked carefully inside the flap, almost hidden, were dog tags, their steel dulled but still bearing the name William Hayes, United States Army. In his lap lay his cap. It was folded neatly, always neatly, as though ceremony mattered even here, even now. The cap was not for warmth. Its fabric was thin, its brim frayed, but for memory. He kept it visible because it reminded him of who he had been, of the years when he wore it proudly among bros in arms who never questioned his worth. To anyone else, it was just an old piece of cloth. To William, it was the last remnant of his place in the world. He did not beg. He did not call out to passersby or rattle a cup for change. That had never been his way. He preferred the quiet, the small dignity of presence without demand. He had learned long ago that people often gave more freely when you didn't ask. A sandwich left beside him, a coffee pressed into his hands, a blanket passed over with a muttered "stay warm." Those gestures meant more to him than coins tossed without thought. They carried intention, and William respected that. The commuters streamed past in steady waves. A young woman in a blazer hurried by, heels clicking against the damp pavement, her eyes flicking toward him before darting away. A teenager with headphones glanced briefly, curiosity tugging at him. But his mother pulled him along quickly, her grip firm. A man in a reflective vest paused long enough to nod, a quiet acknowledgement between strangers, before moving on. Most didn't notice at all. They were caught up in their phones, their coffee, their deadlines. To them, William was another shadow, stitched into the fabric of the city. But even shadows carry weight. William's gaze drifted across the street, unfocused but steady. He was not lost in the way people imagined. His mind was sharp enough, though it often wandered back to places where time still bled red, where nights stretched on forever, broken only by the crack of rifles and the bark of orders. He didn't speak of those days. He rarely spoke at all. Words he had learned were often wasted on people who weren't listening. Silence was easier. Silence was truer. His stomach growled softly, a reminder that breakfast was a luxury. He ignored it, reaching instead for the notebook tucked in his duffel. The pages were weather-worn, smudged from damp fingers and rain, but each line meant something to him. He wrote in fragments, sometimes only a word or two memories, names, coordinates he could never quite forget. This morning, he added a line: dawn again, rain again, still here. The street had no idea of his history. They saw the present, not the past. They saw the coat, but not the medals once pinned to it. They saw the duffel, but not the miles marched with it on his back. They saw the silence, but not the discipline that kept it intact. And so William Hayes sat on the bench, quiet, overlooked, blending into the rhythm of the waking block. But in his stillness, there was something more on Anchor the Street did, not yet recognized, because storms don't always announce themselves with thunder. Sometimes they sit quietly on a bench at dawn, waiting for the moment when the world finally notices them again. The city moved on, unaware. But William was already part of the story that was coming. He just didn't know it yet. The street had fully awakened now. What had begun as scattered footsteps in the quiet dawn grew into a steady current of motion, a tide of humanity flowing through Jefferson and Main as the city shouldered itself into the day. Cars multiplied, horns flaring briefly as drivers jostled for position at intersections. The hiss of the bus brakes came every few minutes now, spilling passengers onto the pavement. Their eyes, still heavy with sleep, were already narrowed with focus. The hum of morning traffic merged with a chatter of voices, the rhythm of heels and sneakers striking wet pavement. The rustle of coats shaken off as the sun inched reluctantly higher. William Hayes sat still on the bench, the current of life breaking around him, like water around a stone. People noticed, but only in the way they might notice a lamppost or a trash can, a shape that existed without truly belonging to their personal orbit. They carried on with their mornings, absorbed in deadlines, meetings, and the quiet panic of schedules that always seemed tighter than they should be. He was there, yes, but not really there. A woman in a slate gray suit walked briskly, her phone pressed tightly to her ear. "I said 10%, not 12. She snapped into the device, her eyes flicking briefly toward the bench. She registered the worn coat, the slumped figure, but dismissed him in the same breath. She said, "Get it fixed before the board sees it." She was gone before William had even blinked. Two teenagers followed close behind, one with a skateboard tucked beneath his arm, the other dragging his backpack with a board slouch. They glanced at William, longer than the businesswoman had, whispering between themselves. "Bet he's crazy," one muttered, snickering. The other shrugged, but his eyes lingered on the veteran's duffel, and the faded cap resting in his lap. Something about the way William held himself dignified, despite the weathered clothing, kept him from laughing too. But he didn't stop, either. They passed, and the moment was over. A young mother tugged her daughter close as she approached. The child, no older than 6, stared with wide, unfiltered curiosity. "Why's he sitting there, Mama?" she asked, tugging at her mother's sleeve. The mother quickened her pace, murmuring, "Don't stare, sweetheart," her tone tight with discomfort. The little girl turned her head even as she was pulled along, her bright eyes locked on the man on the bench until the crowd swallowed them. Not everyone looked away. An older gentleman in a ball cap paused as he passed, his gait slowed by age. His eyes fell on the duffel bag and the dog tags half hidden beneath the flap. For a moment, recognition softened his features. He tipped his cap slightly, a gesture so subtle most would have missed it. William returned it with the faintest nod, his lips pressing together in the smallest of acknowledgments. It was enough. Then the old man shuffled on, disappearing into the river of commuters. The bakery across the street released its second wave of warm air, sweeter now with a sharp edge of cinnamon. A delivery driver pushed through the doors, balancing a crate of bread, muttering about traffic into the Bluetooth in his ear. Behind him, 2 college students debated politics loudly, their voices spilling across the pavement like careless graffiti. "The system's broken," one declared. "We need reform, man." Neither spared William a glance as they marched past. The veteran's silence stretched into the noise, a steady thread against the clamor. He didn't move, didn't call out, didn't even lower his gaze when people stared too long. His stillness was a shield, and in some way, it unsettled those who looked too closely. In a city addicted to motion, stillness was its own kind of defiance. More phones appeared now, glowing rectangles lifted into the air, some angled vaguely in his direction. Not for him, not yet, but for the city's morning scenes, the neon diner sign flickering, the bakery door propped open, the steady surge of buses groaning at the curb. But William was always caught in the edges of those frames. A blurred figure on the bench, anonymous but unignorable. A group of office workers slowed briefly, one whispering, "Poor guy." Another replied, "He should get help." A third added, "City's full of them." Their words, like coins tossed carelessly into a fountain, clinked into the silence and were gone, leaving no ripple behind. The flow of people thickened, shoes squeaked on damp pavement, laughter flared and vanished. Car engines idled at red lights, and the smell of fried eggs and coffee wafted from the diner's open vent. The city's chorus grew louder, but beneath it all William Hayes remained, steady, quiet, unflinching. Most would forget him before they reached their desks. He was another passing shadow, another figure absorbed into the anonymity of the city's dawn. But some, just a few, would carry the image with them longer than they expected. The old man tipping his cap, the little girl staring wide, the teenager who had almost laughed but didn't. They wouldn't know why. But the memory would linger. Because even in stillness, William was part of the street's rhythm, a figure on the bench at dawn, silent and unseen, but destined to become the center of a storm the crowd hadn't yet imagined. Would you like me to keep going chapter by chapter in this novelistic cinematic flow? Or should I expand into full script format, dialogue, and action beats? Once we reached the confrontation with the officer, the hum of the morning was broken by a deeper sound, the low rolling purr of an engine that did not belong to taxis or delivery vans. A patrol car eased its way down Jefferson, its polished black and white frame cutting through the gray light. Like a blade, the red and blue light bar atop the roof was dark, but the presence of the vehicle was enough to shift the rhythm of the street. People always noticed patrol cars. Some straightened their posture, others avoided looking at it altogether, and a few visibly relaxed, as though reassured by the sight of authority cruising past. Officer Daniels was at the wheel, his left arm draped casually over the window, his fingers drumming against the side of the door in restless rhythm. He was a man who carried his badge, not just as authority, but as a stage. His jaw was square, his hair cropped close, his sunglasses still perched on the bridge of his nose, though the sun was hardly strong enough to warrant them. He carried himself like someone who had been praised too often by people who wanted his approval and rarely corrected by those who should have held him accountable. His uniform was pressed so tightly it might have been starched into place. His boots shined to a mirror finish. He looked the part, and Daniels knew it. Beside him sat Officer Morales. Older, quieter, his eyes fixed on the street ahead, rather than on the reflection of himself in the side mirror. Morales didn't fidget with the wheel, didn't drum his fingers, didn't bother with theatrics. He had worn the badge long enough to know the difference between presence and posturing. Daniels, however, thrived on the posturing. As the cruiser crept down Jefferson, Daniels scanned the sidewalks with idle curiosity, the way some people scroll their phones looking for entertainment. He was not hunting crime, he was looking for amusement, for something to break the monotony of another shift. His lips curled into a smirk as his eyes fell on the figure on the bench. "Would you look at that?" Daniels muttered, leaning slightly toward the glass. Another one of the city's finest decorating benches, instead of protecting the country. His tone dripped sarcasm, as though the man's stillness was a personal affront to the order of the block. Morales glanced toward the bench and said nothing. He recognized the markers, instantly the duffel bag, the dog tags half visible from its pocket, the cap folded neatly in the man's lap. He knew better than to mistake William Hayes for just another homeless figure blending into the background, but silence came easily to Morales, and in moments like these, silence was safer than sparking Daniels' appetite for cruelty. Daniels slowed the cruiser, pulling it up to the curb with a little flourish of the wheel, as though arriving at a performance. The tires hissed against wet pavement. Pedestrians nearby glanced up, instinctively wary when a patrol car stopped. The crowd thinned slightly, giving the car and the officers inside a wider berth. Daniels thrived on that tooth-away people, moved differently in the presence of his uniform. He killed the engine, his movements deliberate, then tugged once at the edge of his vest, as though rehearsing his authority. "Time to wake up our friend," he said, his smirk deepening into something sharper. Morales shifted in his seat, his jaw tightening, but still he said nothing. The driver's door opened with a heavy thunk. Daniels stepped out, his boots striking the pavement in crisp rhythm, the sound louder than necessary in the morning hush. A few people slowed their steps, curiosity tugging at them, but none stopped outright. They'd seen encounters like this before. Most ended with a warning, sometimes a ticket, always with the reminder that some people belonged and others didn't. Daniels adjusted his belt, his radio crackling softly at his side. He didn't look at the crowd, didn't acknowledge the bakery worker who paused mid-step with a crate in his arms, or the college students who slowed to whisper. His attention was fixed squarely on William Hayes, still seated on the bench, his posture unchanged. The veteran looked up briefly, his gray eyes steady but unreadable, then lowered them again, his hand resting lightly on the cap in his lap. Daniels smirked again. To him, silence was weakness. To him, stillness was surrender. He mistook the quiet dignity of William Hayes for something lesser, something easy to mock. He didn't see the man's history, the weight of the dog tags, the decades etched into his face. He saw only a target for amusement. Morales watched from the passenger seat, his hand flexing once against his thigh. He had seen Daniels like this before, swaggering, searching, eager to display his authority when none was needed. He opened his mouth, then closed it. He would wait. He would watch. Intervention too soon might only fan the flames. The city block held its breath as Daniels approached the bench. His shadow fell across William Hayes, long and sharp against the pavement. The crowd moved around them, pretending not to look, but stealing glances nonetheless. They could feel the shift, the tension, the weight of something about to happen. And William Hayes, steady as stone, simply sat and waited. The sound of Officer Daniels' boots striking wet pavement carried farther than it should have. Each step was precise, intentional, meant to announce himself before he even opened his mouth. Pedestrians felt the vibration of his presence before they saw his face and authority entering the stage, preparing to command, yet not all authority was respected, and the silence that rippled through the crowd as he drew near spoke of unease, rather than admiration. William Hayes remained seated on the bench. He had noticed the patrol car long before it stopped, his gray eyes cutting briefly toward it. When the engine's hum had slowed, he had been trained to notice small things, long before the city made it second nature. He could read intent in a man's walk, in the tilt of his shoulders, in the way his voice filled space. Daniel's intent was obvious. He moved not as a protector but as a performer, eager for an audience. "Morning, sunshine," Daniels called, his tone falsely bright, his smirk already curling. He stopped in front of the bench, hands on his belt, his chest puffed beneath the crisp uniform. "Comfortable spot you got here. Bench duty, huh? Thought the army taught better than loitering." His words struck sharp in the morning air, cutting through the hum of traffic and chatter. Several commuters slowed, their steps faltering. They didn't stop outright. No one wanted to be part of a sign, but they lingered within earshot. The bakery worker paused with his crate balanced on his hip. The teenagers with the skateboard leaned against a lamppost, eyes wide. Even the jogger who had passed minutes earlier looped back around, earbuds hanging loose, drawn by the shift in atmosphere. Hayes didn't respond. His hand rested lightly on the folded cap in his lap, his thumb brushing the fabric's frayed edge. His silence was not ignorance, nor fear. It was measured, deliberate. He had learned long ago that not every battle required a voice. Daniels didn't see silence as strength. He saw it as weakness, an opening. He leaned slightly forward, narrowing his eyes. "What's the matter, old man? Cat got your tongue? Or maybe you're too used to waiting for someone else to tell you what to do." He chuckled, shaking his head as though the joke were shared, though no one laughed. From the cruiser, Morales shifted in his seat, his eyes narrowing. He had seen this play out before. Daniels poking, prodding, waiting for a spark he could claim as justification. Morales' hand hovered near the door handle, torn between stepping in and staying back. His silence wasn't approval, but it wasn't resistance either. It was the hesitation of someone who knew that challenging Daniels too soon might only make things worse. The crowd grew thicker in subtle ripples. Phones appeared, lifted discreetly at first, then more openly as whispers spread. "What's happening? He's hassling that guy on the bench. Is he homeless? Looks like a vet." The murmurs layered over one another, a chorus of judgment that Daniels either didn't notice or chose to ignore. He was focused on the man in front of him, the silent figure who refused to rise, to react, to acknowledge. Daniels' smirk hardened. He reached down suddenly, flicking the cap from Hayes' lap with the back of his fingers. The motion was quick, dismissive, designed to humiliate. The cap tumbled to the wet pavement, landing brim up, catching a streak of morning light in the puddle beside it. A gasp rolled through the nearest bystanders. The sound was soft but unanimous, the kind of collective intake of breath that spoke of shock and disapproval. For the first time, Hayes moved. Slowly, deliberately, he bent forward, retrieved the cap, and set it back in his lap. His hands were steady, his posture unbroken. He did not look at Daniels. He did not speak. The silence grew heavier, sharper, more uncomfortable with every second. Daniels straightened, sneering at the lack of response. To him, the absence of protest was an invitation to press further. To the crowd, it was the opposite. They saw a man enduring, choosing dignity where others might have erupted. Daniels leaned closer, lowering his voice just enough to drip venom. "You know what I think? I think if you really served, you wouldn't be sitting here now. You'd have figured it out. You'd be worth something." The words hung, poisonous, heavier than his earlier jabs. Morales' jaw clenched inside the cruiser. A woman near the bakery shook her head, muttering, "Unbelievable." The teenagers glanced at each other, their earlier amusement gone, replaced with something sharper: disgust, maybe even anger. William Hayes finally lifted his gaze. His gray eyes locked on Daniels, steady, unflinching, carved with the weight of battles fought long before this street. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. His stare was enough. A mirror that reflected Daniels' cruelty back at him. The first ripple of truth passed through the crowd. Then they could feel it, that this was no ordinary man, no ordinary silence. And though the storm had only just begun, the tide had already started to turn. The rain-slick street seemed to hush as Officer Daniels straightened over the man on the bench, his shadow stretching long across the wet pavement. The crowd's murmurs dimmed, but the silence was not respect. It was tension, the kind that coils around a scene like barbed wire, daring anyone to touch it. Daniels mistook that silence for authority. He mistook the crowd's stillness for submission. William Hayes sat unmoved, his cap returned neatly to his lap, his hand resting lightly upon it, as though it were an object sacred to be left vulnerable again. His posture was quiet, resolute, the kind of composure earned from years where panic meant death and patience meant survival. To the onlookers, his silence was a monument. To Daniels, it was an insult. "Well," Daniels said, his voice louder now, pitched to carry beyond the bench and into the ears of the watching crowd. "I guess they don't teach manners where you came from. Sitting out here like you owned a place. Tell me, old-timer, is this the victory you fought for? A bench, a bag of junk, and strangers pretending you don't exist?" His words were sharp, calculated to sting, to draw a reaction. He didn't see the tightening of shoulders among bystanders, didn't hear the low hiss of disapproval rising from a woman near the bakery door. He only saw Hayes, still as stone, refusing to flinch, refusing to feed the performance. Daniels crouched slightly, closing the space between them, his polished badge glinting just inches from Hayes' weathered eyes. "You know, people like me keep these streets clean. People like me make sure decent folks don't have to trip over." He gestured at the duffel, the coat, the boots, his hand slicing the air with disdain. "Trash like this." The cruelty landed like a slap. In the crowd, a man in a ball cap muttered, "That's enough," though his voice was low, meant only for the woman beside him. She nodded, clutching her coffee tighter, her knuckles whitening. Phones shifted higher now, no longer subtle but brazen, lenses pointed directly at Daniels. The click of a camera app sounded faintly above the traffic, small but undeniable. Hayes exhaled slowly, his eyes never leaving the officers. He did not rise, did not speak, did not give Daniels the scene he craved. His silence was louder than words could have been, and it was infuriating. "Cat got your tongue," Daniels sneered. "Or maybe you only speak when someone's barking orders. Bet you missed that, don't you? March here, march there. Now look at you can't even march to a shelter." He let out a laugh that rang false. Brittle, the duffel bag at Hayes' feet, shifted slightly as a passing breeze tugged its flap open. A corner of steel caught the light. Dog tags, dull but unmistakable, glimmered for an instant before slipping back into shadow. A murmur rippled through the crowd. One of the teenagers whispered, "He's a vet." The word spread faster than traffic, carried by whispers, passed from mouth to mouth until even those at the edges of the gathering knew. Daniels hadn't noticed. Or worse, he didn't care. He tapped the brim of his cap mockingly with 2 fingers, then wagged them as though scolding a child. "Here's a tip. If you're going to play soldier, maybe try not losing the war against a paycheck." This time the crowd didn't stay quiet. A voice rose sharp from the edge of the onlookers. "Show some respect, officer," a woman shouted. Her voice breaking the seal of silence. Another voice followed, then another. "He's a veteran. Leave him alone." Daniels turned his head slightly, smirk broadening, as though the jeers were applause. "Oh, don't get sentimental. On me," he said, raising his hands theatrically toward the crowd. "Half these guys claim they served. Most couldn't find their way out of boot camp." His laugh was louder now, harsher, but the laughter didn't spread. It died in the air, swallowed by the disapproving stares and the cold, unflinching silence of William Hayes. The weight of judgment had shifted. The phones, the eyes, the murmurs, they were no longer passive. They were witnesses. Hayes finally moved. His fingers brushed the dog tags tucked into his bag, then rested once more on his cap. His lips parted slightly, but no words came yet. His gaze, steady and unbroken, locked on Daniels with a quiet ferocity that unsettled even those watching from across the street. The officer leaned back, scoffing. "Yeah, that's what I thought. Nothing to say." He adjusted his vest, puffing himself larger, mistaking the crowd's anger for irrelevance. But those around him knew better. The storm was no longer gathering. It had arrived. The street was no longer simply busy, it was charged. Commuters who had once hurried past now slowed, feet dragging against damp pavement as if tethered to the unfolding moment. Phones rose higher, no longer shy, no longer discreet. The air held a strange electricity, like the sharp tang before a summer storm. All of it swirled around the bench where William Hayes sat, unmoving, and the officer who mistook stillness for surrender. Daniels shifted his weight, scanning the faces now fixed upon him. He saw the cameras, but interpreted them as props, believing he was still the director of this scene. He smirked, playing to his imagined audience. See, nothing to say. Man sits on his bench, day after day, waiting for someone else to clean up his mess. The city deserves better. But the words rang hollow in the air. They lacked power, because the silence of Hayes filled every space between them. His silence was not absence, it was presence. It was steady, deliberate, the kind of silence that comes from men who have already seen the worst of noise and survived it. Hayes sat upright, his back straight despite the fatigue etched in his bones. His hands, though rough and weathered, were precise as they smoothed the fabric of his coat across his knees. He did not fidget, did not avert his gaze. He only looked forward, eyes gray as stone, calm and unshaken. That calmness unnerved the crowd more than Daniel's bluster. It was dignity carved out of suffering, the kind that needed no defense. A child whispered too loudly from the edge of the gathering. "Mama, why isn't he talking?" The mother hushed him gently, but her own eyes were fixed on the bench. Her lips pressed thin, her arms hugging her son closer. The truth of Hayes' silence began to dawn on the crowd. Some recognized it instantly, the veterans among them, or the sons and daughters of those who had come home quiet after wars. They knew what that stillness meant. It was not weakness. It was discipline. It was control. It was the refusal to give a fool the satisfaction of reaction. Daniels didn't understand. He mistook the murmurs for restlessness, mistook the crowd's weighty stares for background noise. He leaned closer, crouching again, his voice low but venomous. "You think sitting there makes you noble? You're just a relic, forgotten, invisible. A uniform doesn't mean a damn thing when you're living on concrete." Hayes moved, but only slightly. His fingers curled around the cap in his lap, lifting it, holding it steady in both hands. He brushed its brim once, a gesture so small it might have gone unnoticed. But to those watching closely, it carried meaning. The way one might polish a medal before placing it back on display. His eyes lifted to meet Daniel's. And in that gaze, something shifted. It was not rage. It was not plea. It was endurance, sharpened into steel. It was the gaze of a man who had once followed orders into fire, who had held bleeding men in his arms, and whispered prayers into smoke. It was the gaze of someone who had no need for words to declare his worth. The crowd felt it. A murmur rippled again, different this time. Not outrage. Reverence. The man in the ball cap from earlier took a step forward, his voice steady. He served, show some respect. Another voice followed. A woman's this time, louder. "He's a veteran. Leave him be." Daniels straightened, sharply, his jaw tightening. "Back off," he barked, turning toward the crowd. "This is police business." His voice cracked against the growing weight of disapproval. But the silence of Hayes was louder. He did not move. He did not rise. He simply sat, holding his cap, his dog tags glinting faintly from the half-opened duffel at his feet. That quiet dignity filled the space in a way Daniel's words never could. The jogger who had looped back raised his phone higher, his voice carrying clear. "We're all witnesses. Everyone can see who's the problem here." The crowd murmured. Agreement, heads nodding, whispers swelling into something closer to defiance. Daniels glanced at Morales, still seated in the cruiser. Morales' eyes were hard now, fixed on him, not on the crowd. For the first time, Daniels felt the ground shift beneath his boots. His show was faltering, and Hayes, still silent, still steady, remained the anchor of it all. The murmurs had thickened into a low, steady current of voices. What had started as scattered gasps and whispered judgments now moved like a tide rising, insistent, undeniable. The people who had once pretended not to see, who had kept their eyes fixed on phones and coffee cups, now leaned forward with open attention. The scene on Jefferson was no longer background noise. It had become the center of gravity for the entire block. William Hayes did nothing to encourage it. He remained seated on the bench, still as stone, his cap resting quietly in his lap, his gray eyes trained forward without flinching. The silence he carried radiated outward, wrapping around the crowd like a cord, pulling them closer together. For decades he had learned the value of patience, waiting in foxholes, waiting in hospital wards, waiting on news that rarely brought comfort. That patience now became his greatest weapon, though he never sought to wield it. Daniels, however, felt the shift. The crowd's energy pressed on him like heat, stinging his neck, crawling up his collar. He turned slightly, scanning the faces around him. Dozens of phones hovered high, their glowing screens reflecting in his sunglasses. He saw their eyes, too hard, unblinking, less passive than before. They weren't avoiding him anymore. They were holding him accountable. "All right, enough gawking," Daniel snapped, his voice carrying too sharp, too defensive. He jabbed a finger toward the bakery worker, who had stopped mid-delivery, balancing a crate of bread on his hip. "Keep moving. Show's over." But the man didn't move. His jaw tightened, his arms straining against the weight of the crate, but his feet stayed rooted. Slowly, carefully, he set the bread down on the curb, as though laying aside a burden. "You don't talk to him like that," he said quietly, almost reverently, gesturing toward Hayes. "Not him." The words cut clean through the murmurs. People nodded, shifting closer. The teenagers with the skateboard shuffled forward, their earlier nervous snickers gone, their eyes bright with something else, anger, maybe admiration. The jogger lowered his earbuds completely now, his phone still filming, but his voice firm. "Everyone's recording. You can't hide this." Daniel's smirk faltered. "Back up," he barked, stepping away from Hayes, trying to redirect his authority outward. "All of you. This isn't your business." But the words were wrong. The crowd had already decided it was their business. The act of filming made it theirs. The act of witnessing made it theirs. What had once been a private humiliation was now a collective reckoning. And they would not retreat. Todd Hayes still hadn't spoken. His hand brushed once against the dog tags, glinting faintly from the duffel. The gesture small, but visible. It was enough to confirm what many already suspected. He wasn't just another man on a bench. He was one of theirs, someone who had carried the weight of service, who had paid his dues in ways Daniels could never understand. "He's a veteran." The woman near the bakery called again, louder this time, her voice carrying like a bell. "And you're mocking him?" More voices joined. "Disgraceful. That's not what the badge is for. Respect the uniform he wore." The crowd's judgment layered over itself until it became a chant of sorts, not in rhythm, not coordinated, but united in its condemnation. Morales finally opened the passenger door of the cruiser, stepping out with careful movements. His posture wasn't aggressive, his hands stayed loose at his sides. But his presence was enough to deepen the silence for a moment. The crowd shifted, watching him, waiting. He didn't speak, not yet. But his eyes told the story. They weren't on Hayes. They weren't on the crowd. They were fixed squarely on Daniels. Daniels felt the walls closing in, crowd at his back, partner at his side, silence in front of him, and every lens in the city aimed at his mistakes. He tried again, forcing authority into his voice. "This man is loitering. He's obstructing," but the crowd roared over him now, their words breaking like surf against stone. "He's not obstructing anything. He's sitting on a bench. You're the obstruction here." Daniels' mouth worked, but no words came out. For the first time that morning, his performance faltered. He was not the conductor of this scene anymore. He was the spectacled. And through it all, William Hayes never lifted his voice, never shifted his posture. His silence remained intact, stronger than Daniel's authority, stronger than the crowd's outrage. He was the anchor while the city tilted. Around him, the tension had reached its breaking point. It wasn't violence that loomed, but judgment. Something heavier, something final. And though Daniels still barked and blustered, though the crowd still murmured and recorded, everyone knew what was coming. The storm had crested. All that was left was the fall. The murmurs of the crowd had swelled into something close to open defiance. Voices overlapped. Phones hovered like lanterns in the gray light, and Officer Daniels' words rang weaker with every attempt to reclaim control. His posture was sharp, his tone clipped, but the performance was failing. Authority without respect is only costume. And the crowd had stripped him of it piece by piece. Then came a new sound, the deep growl of a larger engine, rolling slowly up Jefferson. It wasn't a bus or a delivery van. It was a second patrol vehicle, heavier, darker, moving with a steadiness that spoke of higher rank. The crowd shifted instinctively, their murmurs thinning into sharp whispers. The car pulled up behind Daniel's cruiser, its headlights cutting a white glare across the pavement before dimming. The driver's door opened, and out stepped Chief Raymond Hollis. He wasn't a man who needed to raise his voice to command a room or, in this case, a street. His presence carried the kind of gravity born not from polished shoes or ironed uniforms, but from years in which leadership had been tested in fire. Hollis was in his late 50s, broad-shouldered despite the age, his hair silvering at the edges, but his eyes still sharp, cold blue under the morning haze. He walked with purpose, each step measured, his boots steady against the damp concrete dot. The crowd recognized the shift instantly. Where Daniels had brought tension, Hollis brought silence. The phones didn't lower, but the whispers dimmed. People leaned in, holding their breath, as though sensing the arrival of judgment itself. Daniels straightened at once, relief flickering across his features. Authority had arrived. His authority, or so he thought. He raised his chin, gesturing toward Hayes as though presenting evidence. "Chief," he began, his voice louder, trying to sound firm. "This man's been loitering, causing disturbance. I was handling it." Hollis didn't answer him. He didn't even glance at him. His eyes went straight to the bench. There sat William Hayes, the same as he had been since Donstrat backed, cap resting in his lap, gray eyes unflinching. The silence around him was no longer just his own. It had become the silence of the street, the silence of witnesses, the silence of judgment. Hollis stopped a few feet away, his gaze lingering on the duffel, the faint glint of dog tags, the posture of a man who had nothing to prove. "Sir," Hollis said at last, his voice calm, measured. "Are you all right?" It was a simple question, but it shifted the entire scene. The crowd stirred, nodding, whispering approval. Their eyes cut sharply toward Daniels, who swallowed hard, his face paling beneath the sun. Hayes inclined his head once, his lips parting just enough. His voice was low, gravel worn smooth by years, but steady. "I'm fine." The answer was enough. It didn't need elaboration. It carried the weight of truth, of composure, of dignity, untouched by the venom that had been thrown at him. Only then did Hollis turn to Daniels. His expression was unreadable, carved from stone, but his eyes burned. "Officer Daniels," he said, his tone firm but controlled. "Step aside." Daniels froze, his chest puffing, as though to argue, but the crowd's eyes were too many, the phones too numerous, the silence too heavy. He stepped back reluctantly, his boots scraping against pavement. Hollis scanned the crowd, then, acknowledging them with a brief nod, a gesture that both reassured and commanded patience. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice carrying, without effort, "thank you for your concern. The situation is under review." His words were clipped, procedural, but they carried the authority Daniels had tried and failed to wield. The bakery worker crossed his arms. The jogger muttered, "About time." The teenagers whispered to each other, excitement buzzing in their eyes. The crowd's tension eased slightly, not gone, but bent toward resolution. Hollis faced Hayes once more. His tone softened, just slightly. "Thank you for your patience, sir." Hayes met his gaze, then lowered his eyes back to the cap in his lap. He said nothing. He didn't need to. The chief turned back to Daniels, his face darkening. "We'll talk now." And in that moment, the crowd knew the storm was not over. It had only changed direction. The silence that followed Chief Hollis' command was heavier than the damp air. Clinging to the street, Daniels shifted on his feet, the stiff line of his shoulders betraying the sudden unease in his chest. He had expected backup. He had expected a nod, a quiet word of affirmation, the chief brushing off the murmuring crowd so the morning could resume its rhythm. Instead, he had been told to step aside to words that cut deeper than any accusation. The crowd felt the shift instantly, phones angled higher, their lenses gleaming in the gray light. Even those who had been cautious before now filmed openly, sensing that the real moment was about to unfold. The bakery worker straightened, arms crossed, his bread crate forgotten. The jogger stopped stretching and leaned forward, earbuds dangling useless at his chest. The teenagers whispered, "He's in trouble," their voices buzzing with the thrill of witnessing authority turn inward. Hollis' eyes stayed fixed on Daniels, cold and unflinching. He didn't raise his voice, didn't need to. Authority wrapped around him naturally, a mantle worn by those who had earned it through years of service, not through the shine of polished boots. "Officer Daniels," Hollis said, his words clipped, deliberate. "Explain yourself." Daniels cleared his throat, glancing quickly at the crowd, before focusing on his superior. "Chief, the man was loitering. He's obstructing public space." "Stop," Hollis' voice cut clean through the morning noise, sharper than sirens. "I didn't ask for excuses. I asked for an explanation." Daniels faltered, the smirk he had worn like armor slipping at the edges. He looked toward the bench, at William Hayes still seated calmly, and back at the crowd whose eyes burned holes into his uniform. "I was maintaining order." He tried again, his words slower, weaker, making sure the area stayed clear. The crowd murmured disapproval, A woman near the bakery shook her head, muttering, "Order." He was sitting. Others echoed softly, the tide of judgment swelling. Hollis let the murmurs roll before he spoke again. "That man," he said, pointing toward Hayes with a steady hand, "is a citizen sitting quietly on a public bench. That man," he added, his voice heavier now, "is a veteran of this country. And you," his gaze locked on Daniels, unblinking, "mocked him, humiliated him, and turned your badge into a weapon for your ego." The words landed like hammers, each one punctuated by the collective inhale of the crowd. Daniel's face flushed crimson. He opened his mouth, but Hollis raised a hand, silencing him before sound could escape. "Don't," Hollis warned, his tone colder still. "Every word you speak now digs deeper. Every excuse dishonors that man and this department." The crowd stirred. Whispers became open statements now. "That's right." Finally, someone said it. "About time." The voices no longer hid in murmurs, they rose, pressing against Daniels with the weight of public condemnation. Hayes remained unmoved, still holding his cap, still watching quietly. His silence was no longer just his own. It had become the measure by which every other voice was judged. Daniels tried one last time, desperation leaking into his tone. "Chief, you can't just." Hollis' voice struck like a gavel. "I can, and I will, because this badge," he said, tapping the emblem on his chest, "is not a license for cruelty. It is a burden of honor. And today, you proved you are unworthy of carrying it." The crowd exhaled as one, their murmurs swelling into something, cliff to applause, though no hands clapped. It was the sound of justice, of vindication, of a moment turning decisively against arrogance. Phones captured it all. Hollis standing tall, Daniels shrinking under the weight of his words, Hayes still silent, still dignified. The confrontation was not over, but its outcome was already sealed. The tension had gathered to a single point, the way a storm gathers above a field before lightning strikes. The crowd leaned in as one body, their eyes locked on the two officers, the chief broad and steady in his presence, and Daniels, standing stiff and red-faced, sweat beating at his temple despite the cool morning air. William Hayes remained the center of it all, silent on the bench, his cap resting across his lap like a relic, his gaze steady and unyielding. Chief Hollis did not move quickly. He didn't need to. His authority was not in haste, but in weight. Each action deliberate, final. He stepped closer to Daniels, closing the distance until only a foot of damp concrete separated them. Hollis' eyes narrowed, his voice low enough to force the crowd to lean forward, but strong enough to cut through the hum of traffic. "Take it off," he said. Daniels blinked, his mouth opening in confusion, then indignation. "Chief, now," Hollis snapped, his voice ringing like a command on a parade ground. "Your badge off." The crowd gasped as one, the sound sharp, collective, electric. Phones trembled in hands, lenses adjusting, zooming in on the moment. Daniels froze, his hand hovering near the polished shield pinned to his chest. He glanced round at the crowd, at the dozens of eyes, at the phones capturing every bead of sweat on his forehead. His smirk had evaporated entirely. What remained was the face of the man realizing that the stage he had tried to control had turned into a courtroom. "Chief, please," he muttered, his voice cracking, slipping from bravado into desperation. "We can handle this differently. A warning, a write-up." Hollis stepped even closer, his tone like iron. "That man served this country. You mocked him. You belittled him. You struck at his dignity with the authority of this department behind you. There is no warning for that, no write-up. You've disgraced the badge. Take it off." The crowd erupted in murmurs again. Some whispered, "Yes, yes." Others muttered, "Finally." And the weight of their collective approval pressed against Daniel's shoulders like a stone. He shifted on his feet, his hand trembling as it rose slowly, reluctantly, to the badge, gleaming on his chest. Hayes didn't move. He didn't need to. His silence was the anchor, the standard against which all noise was measured. The dog tags glinting faintly from his duffel told the story without words. Daniel's fingers hovered over the badge, hesitating, as though removing it would strip not just metal from fabric, but identity from flesh. He looked desperately toward Morales, still standing by the cruiser. Morales didn't move, didn't speak, didn't offer lifeline or excuse. His silence mirrored Hayes, but its meaning was different. It was judgment. The chief's voice thundered again. "Badge now." Daniel's breath hitched. His hand shook as he unclipped the metal emblem, pulling it from his chest with reluctant fingers. The badge gleamed briefly in the gray light before it fell into Hollis' waiting palm. The sound of The clip snapping free echoed louder than it should have, as if the entire street had amplified it. The crowd gasped, some murmuring he really did it. Phones zoomed in tighter, recording the moment of surrender. Hollis didn't hold the badge up like a trophy. He closed his fist around it, turned his back on Daniels, and faced Hayes. For a moment, his voice softened, carrying only to the man on the bench. On behalf of this city, he said, I apologize. Hayes inclined his head slightly, his lips parting just enough to whisper, understood. That single word, quiet but steady, rippled through the crowd, louder than a shout. Daniels stood frozen, his chest bare where the badge had been. His authority stripped away before the eyes of strangers, recorded into the permanence of 100 phones. The smirk was gone. The swagger was gone. All that remained was a hollow uniform. The crowd's murmurs swelled into something more than whispers now. Respectful words for Hayes, condemning words for Daniels, grateful words for the chief. The tide had turned fully, irreversibly, and as Hollis slipped the badge into his pocket, the moment sealed itself. Daniels was no longer an officer. Hayes was no longer invisible. For a moment, after the badge came off, the entire street seemed suspended in silence. It was not the uneasy quiet of before, nor the sharp hush of tension. It was the silence that follows resolution. When the verdict has been delivered, and all that remains is acknowledgement. The badge, once a symbol of authority, now rested heavy in Chief Hollis' pocket. The man who had worn it stood hollow, stripped not only of metal but of legitimacy, and then the voices rose. At first, it was a single clap, hesitant, almost unsure. The bakery worker, still standing with his empty hands where a crate of bread had been, struck his palms together once more. The sound echoed lightly across the damp street. Then a second clap joined, then another, until the rhythm grew steady, swelling into applause. It wasn't the wild cheer of victory, but the deliberate cadence of respect. William Hayes sat unmoved on the bench, his cap still resting in his lap, but his eyes softened ever so slightly. He wasn't a man who sought ovations. He had spent too many years in silence, too many mornings forgotten by the world, to crave it now. Yet the sound carried a weight that pressed gently against him, recognition he had never asked for but could not deny. Thank you, sir. A woman's voice rang from the edge of the crowd. She stepped forward, her arms clutching the shoulders of her young son. For your service. For your patience. Her eyes shimmered as she looked at him. The boy, wide-eyed and shy, whispered loudly enough for others to hear. He's a hero, Mama. The words rippled outward. Phones still recorded, but their lenses now turned not toward Daniels, shrinking under the weight of disgrace, but toward Hayes, who sat as still and quiet as he had when the morning began. In those glowing screens, the story reshaped itself, not about a cruel officer, not about humiliation, but about dignity held steady against ridicule. The jogger, sweat cooling on his brow, called out next. You didn't even have to say a word. That's strength. His voice cracked slightly, but it carried, and the crowd murmured approval. The teenagers nodded, their earlier restlessness now replaced by awe. One of them muttered, "That's what real respect looks like." His phone still streaming live to an audience that grew by the second. Chief Hollis said nothing. He stood near Hayes, his posture firm but deferential, as if understanding that in this moment the chief himself was only a supporting figure. The center belonged to the veteran. Daniels shifted uneasily, his face pale, his uniform suddenly too heavy. The applause and the murmurs weren't his to receive. They flowed past him, ignoring his presence entirely, as if he were already erased from the story. His disgrace was complete, not because the badge was gone, but because no one in the crowd acknowledged him anymore. A businessman in a wrinkled suit pushed forward, his voice loud with conviction. My father was a Marine. He came home quiet, just like him. People didn't understand, but I do now. Thank you. He extended a hand, but Hayes only gave a small nod in response. His silence still his shield. Even Morales, who had remained near the cruiser all this time, stepped forward finally. He didn't approach Hayes directly, but he stood beside Hollis, his voice low but audible to those nearest. Sir, he said, his words heavy with sincerity, you deserve better than what you were given today. It was as close to an apology as he could offer, and it carried the weight of solidarity. The applause grew louder, no longer hesitant, but resolute. Some clapped, others whispered thanks, and a few simply stood with bowed heads, as if in reverence. The street had transformed into something sacred, no longer just a block of cracked pavement and neon signs, but a place where dignity had been defended, where silence had spoken louder than cruelty. Hayes finally lifted his cap. With slow, deliberate movements, he set it back on his head. It was not a grand gesture, not a performance, but in that moment it felt like ceremony. The crowd fell quieter, the applause tapering into a respectful hush, as if instinctively recognizing the gravity of the act. And when his gray eyes lifted again, they met the crowd's gaze not with pride, but with quiet acknowledgement. He had endured, as he always had. But now, for the first time in a long while, he had not endured alone. Crowd had chosen its symbol, and it was not Daniel's authority, nor even Hollis' command. It was Hayes' silence. Steady and unbroken. A reminder that real strength does not need to shout. The street, once just another block, waking to the monotony of morning, now buzzed with a new kind of life. Where there had been rain-soaked silence and neon fatigue, there was now electricity on unseen current, running between strangers who had, for 1 hour, become witnesses to something greater than themselves. Phones stayed, lifted, but not for Daniels anymore. His face was a shadow in the corner of every recording, the figure already fading into irrelevance. The lenses sought William Hayes, instead his stillness. His cap pulled low now against the pale light, the faint glimmer of dog tags still peeking from the duffel at his feet. Each angle captured the same truth: dignity in silence, composure in humiliation, strength that never once required a raised voice. The videos spread before Hayes even stood from the bench. The teenager with the skateboard had been live streaming since the chief arrived. His feed was now peppered with comments, flying faster than he could read them. That man's a hero. What's wrong with that cop? Respect the veteran. The likes and shares multiplied in real time, as though the street itself had grown a second life online, stretching far beyond the cracked pavement of Jefferson Avenue. The jogger muttered, holding up his phone to the bakery worker beside him. The screen glowed with a local news banner already clipping footage from the livestream. Officer stripped a badge after mocking veteran. The men exchanged glances, shaking their heads, both amazed and unsurprised at how quickly the story had leapt from witness to headline. Chief Hollis noticed it too. He had lived long enough in this city to understand the speed of judgment. In years past, such a confrontation might have ended in silence. The officer shielded, the veteran ignored, the crowd dispersing with mutters, swallowed by time. But not now. Not in an age where every bystander carried a camera, where truth could outrun bureaucracy in a matter of minutes. He turned once more toward Hayes, who sat steady, still silent. "You'll be contacted," Hollis said, his tone quieter now, "by the department. There will be a statement. I'll see to it personally." It wasn't just reassurance. It was a promise. Hayes gave a small nod, though his expression remained unreadable. He wasn't thinking of statements or headlines. He was thinking of the years that had led him here, the battles fought, the friends buried, the long nights on cold streets where no one had clapped, no one had called him a hero, no one had noticed. Today felt strange, almost disorienting. To be the center of reverence. He did not crave it. He simply accepted it. The crowd, however, was not ready to let go. They'd better do more than a statement. Someone called from the back. "That man deserves justice." Another added, "That officer shouldn't wear a uniform again. Not anywhere." The voices layered, thick with anger, but steadied by the sight of Hayes' composure. They weren't clamoring for vengeance. They were demanding respect. Daniels stood apart now, a hollow figure, stripped of badge and dignity, ignored by the very crowd he once commanded. The whispers of justice never touched him directly. They surrounded him like smoke. A constant reminder that he had lost something greater than authority. He had lost legitimacy. As the crowd slowly began to thin, people still stopped by the bench, offering words that ranged from whispers of gratitude to firm declarations of support. "You reminded us what strength looks like. My brother. Served, thank you. You didn't deserve that." Each word was captured, recorded, shared. Building the myth of the quiet man on Jefferson Street. The bakery worker retrieved his crate at last, shaking his head with a weary smile. "They'll be talking about this all day," he muttered, almost to himself. He was wrong. It wouldn't be a day. It would be weeks. It would be headlines. It would be retweets and op-eds and conversations in homes far from this cracked street corner. The whispers of justice had already begun, and William Hayes, though he had not asked for it, had become their symbol. By late afternoon, the rain had returned. It came down in steady sheets that blurred the outlines of the city, washing neon signs into streaks of color and turning Jefferson Avenue into a mirror of trembling light. The street had calmed, the crowd long dispersed, but the echo of the morning lingered in every corner of the city like smoke after a fire. The story had traveled through live streams, through headlines, through the insatiable appetite of social feeds, and it had landed squarely on the shoulders of Chief Raymond Hollis. He sat in his office now, the blinds drawn halfway, the dim light catching the dust motes in the air. The desk before him was cluttered not with the ordinary paperwork of a department head, but with stacks of reports, messages, and press inquiries that had arrived in the space of hours. A red light blinked steadily on his phone, voicemails piling faster than he could listen. Local reporters wanted statements. City officials demanded explanations. Community leaders scheduled urgent meetings. And above it all, the image looped across the television in the corner of his office. Daniels, red-faced and stumbling, his badge removed in front of a veteran seated calm and steady on a weathered bench. The footage was everywhere. Hollis had heard one anchor describe it as the defining image of accountability this city has seen in years. Another headline scrolled across the bottom. Chief Hollis strips officer's badge in public rebuke. Hollis rubbed his temples, the weight of decades pressing against his skull. He had been in uniform long enough to know what moments like this meant. They weren't storms that passed, they were fires that spread. He had chosen, instinctively, to strip Daniels of his badge on the spot. It was the right choice. He didn't doubt that. But now the questions came. What next? A knock at the door broke through his thoughts. Morales stepped in, his uniform damped from the rain, his eyes cautious. "Chief," he said quietly, "the union rep's on the line again. Wants to talk about Daniels." Hollis exhaled slowly. "I'm sure he does. He's saying we jumped protocol, that it should have gone through review boards, hearings, the usual process." "The usual process," Hollis muttered, leaning back in his chair. "The same process that lets officers bury complaints until they vanish in paperwork." His tone was sharp, but not to Morales. It was the bitterness of years, of watching bureaucracy protect the badge more than the people. Morales didn't argue. He simply shifted, his weight uneasy. "What do you want me to tell him?" Hollis stared at the blinking phone light, the red pulse steady as a heartbeat. "Tell him I'll speak when I'm ready." When Morales left, the office grew heavy again, filled only by the sound of rain tapping the glass. Hollis turned in his chair, staring at the framed photographs on the wall. Old academy classes. Officers long retired, faces younger than they had a right to be. He thought of the oath they had all taken, the words that were supposed to mean something. Protect and serve. And then he thought of William Hayes' gray eyes steady. Silence unbroken. Dignity shining brighter than the flashing phones. That man had carried more weight in stillness than Daniels ever had with his badge, and the crowd had recognized it. The city had recognized it. Hollis knew that was the truth he had to stand on. Yet doubt gnawed at him. Would the mayor back him? Would the union tear him apart? Would the department splinter under the pressure of public outrage and internal resentment? He had made a decision on Jefferson Avenue, but leadership didn't end with decision, began with what came after. The phone rang again, sharp and insistent. Hollis let it ring. He stood, moving to the window, watching the rain streak down the glass. The city blurred beyond, alive, restless, waiting. He whispered to himself, a quiet vow, no badge is worth more than respect. Not on my watch. And though the storm outside raged, Hollis felt a strange calm. The dilemma was not whether he had done the right thing. It was how fiercely he was prepared to defend it. The precinct felt colder than usual that evening, though the thermostat still hummed with its same stubborn monotony. Fluorescent lights flickered overhead, washing everything in a sickly white glow. Officer Daniels sat alone in a small briefing room, the blinds drawn tight, the silence thick enough to press against his ribs. He had been told to wait. No partner, no patrol, no paperwork to bury himself in. Just wait. The badge-shaped void on his chest ached more than any bruise he'd ever taken in uniform. His fingers brushed the fabric there unconsciously, seeking the familiar weight, the polished shield that had once meant authority. But there was nothing, only absence. Hours earlier, he had stood on Jefferson Avenue with a smirk, believing himself untouchable. Now, his face was plastered across every phone screen in the city. He had seen the footage replayed online, over and over. The moment his chief stripped him of his badge, the moment his career shattered. The captions burned worse than the images. Disgraced officer removed on the spot. Veteran holds steady while cop humiliates himself. Silence stronger than power. He slammed his fist against the table, the sound echoing in the small room. "This is insane," he muttered, his voice breaking in the emptiness. One mistake. One slip. And they treat me like I'm a criminal. But even as the words left his mouth, they felt hollow. It wasn't one slip, and deep down, Daniels knew it. The memory played itself again, unbidden. The way Hayes had sat so still, so steady, while Daniels mocked him. The way the man hadn't risen, hadn't cursed, hadn't even defended himself. That silence had unsettled him, had made him dig deeper with venom he didn't even understand. He had wanted a reaction. He had needed to feel control. And when none came, he lost himself. Now, the silence followed him here. It haunted him more than the headlines. The door creaked open. Morales stepped inside, his expression unreadable. He shut the door quietly, leaning against it with his arms folded. "You all right?" Morales asked, though his tone carried no sympathy. Daniels scoffed. "Do I look all right? My career's over. My face is a meme. My own chief humiliated me in front of half the city." Morales didn't flinch. "You humiliated yourself." The word stung, sharp as a blade. Daniels sat up straighter, anger flashing in his eyes. "You were there." He was loitering, wasting space. "I was doing my job." Morales shook his head slowly. "No, you weren't keeping order. You were feeding your ego. And now everyone's seen it." Daniel's chest tightened. He wanted to argue, to lash out, but the image of Hayes calm, unmoving, steady under the storm rose unbidden in his mind again. He swallowed hard, his voice dropping. "You think I didn't notice how he just sat there, like he didn't care what I said?" That silence, it was worse than if he'd fought back. Morales' eyes softened, but only slightly. "That man's been through more than you'll ever understand. And you mocked him for it. You'll live with that, badge or no badge." Daniels looked away, his jaw clenched, his fists tight. The truth was unbearable, yet inescapable. Outside, rain drummed against the windows, steady and relentless. The chief would decide his fate in the coming days. The city had already decided, and in the dark of the empty room, Daniels finally felt it. The crushing weight, not of authority lost, but of respect he had never truly earned. The rain had washed the streets clean by evening, leaving Jefferson Avenue slick and reflective, as though the city itself had been forced to pause and take stock of the day. The neon signs buzzed back to life, glowing brighter against the wet pavement. Storefronts resumed their rhythm, doors opening, shutters rattling, customers stepping out with umbrellas tilted against the drizzle. The world, it seemed, had moved on. But on the worn bench near the bakery, William Hayes still sat. His cap shielded his eyes, his duffel bag rested at his boots, and his dog tags caught faint glints of the passing streetlights. For hours, he had been the axis around which the storm of outrage turned. Crowds had gathered and dispersed, phones had filmed and flown into the digital ether, badges had been stripped, reputations shattered. Now the street was quiet again, save for the hiss of passing tires on wet asphalt. Hayes finally shifted. Slowly, with the care of a man who carried not only years but burdens, he rose from the bench. His knees cracked softly, the sound muffled by the hum of the city. He picked up the duffel, slinging it over his shoulder with practiced ease. The weight seemed heavy, but familiar, as though it belonged to him as much as the silence he wore like armor. For a moment, he stood there, gazing down the length of Jefferson. His eyes lingered not on the neon or the storefronts, but on the empty stretch where the crowd had once gathered. He could still hear their applause, their whispers, their gratitude. He could still feel the way their judgment had fallen, not on him but on the man who mocked him. Yet none of it seemed to settle on his shoulders. Hayes had learned long ago not to measure himself by the noise of others. A woman passing with a grocery bag paused. She recognized him instantly, the veteran, the man from the video already circulating faster than gossip. She hesitated, then offered softly, "Thank you. For today. For everything." Hayes gave a brief nod. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. She smiled faintly and moved on, her footsteps fading into the drizzle. He walked slowly, his boots steady against the wet pavement. Each step echoed with a rhythm that seemed older than the city itself. Soldier's gait measured, deliberate. The streetlight shadows stretched and bent around him, framing his figure against the slick glow of the avenue. Inside the bakery, the worker who had first stepped out that morning pressed a hand against the window, watching him. He whispered almost to himself, "That man changed everything today." But Hayes didn't hear it. He didn't need to. As he moved down the block, the whispers followed him, not out loud, but carried in the minds of those who had witnessed the day's events. To the crowd, he was no longer invisible. He was a reminder that dignity, when held fast, could outweigh arrogance. That silence, when chosen, could roar louder than cruelty. That strength, when disciplined, could steady even the most chaotic storm. When he reached the corner, he stopped. The rain had lightened to a mist, and the city spread before him in streaks of neon and shadow. He pulled the cap lower over his brow, adjusted the strap of his duffel, and turned left, disappearing into the rhythm of the evening. The bench stood empty now, but it bore the memory of what had happened there. The crowd had gone. The chief had left. Even the officer had been swallowed by his disgrace. But the story remained. The bench, the badge, the silence, they were etched into the city's pulse. Hayes walked on. Not to applause, not to recognition, but to the quiet he had always sought. And in that quiet, he carried the day's truth with him. Strength does not always need to be seen. Sometimes, it only needs to walk away. By nightfall, Jefferson Avenue was empty of onlookers. But the city was not silent. It hummed with a different kind of noise, the endless chatter of screens, the ceaseless scroll of feeds, the digital pulse of a story too sharp to stay contained. What had begun on a rain-slicked street corner that morning had already ignited across televisions, phones, and laptops in homes and cafes, offices and dorm rooms. The first local station broke the story before noon. A clip, grainy but clear, played in a tight loop. Officer Daniels standing before a homeless veteran, words sharp, face twisted in disdain. Then the veteran's stillness. Then the chief's command. And finally, the badge, removed in one deliberate motion, vanishing into a pocket heavy with consequence. The anchor's voice carried gravity as the headline burned across the screen. Chief removes officer's badge after mocking veteran. The segment ended, but the video did not. It leapt from local feeds to national networks, reshared with captions that sharpened the story further. Silent veteran, loud justice, strength without words. The day a badge fell. Each retelling clipped away nuance, but none could erase the power of the images, the smirk, the silence, the badge removed. On social media, the story spread like fire in dry grass. The teenager's livestream had already racked up thousands of views by the time he stepped off Jefferson Avenue. But within hours, it reached millions. Comment sections swelled with outrage at Daniels, admiration for the veteran, respect for the chief. That man didn't even need to speak. That's what real strength looks like. My dad was a vet. Watching this hit hard. This officer forgot what the badge means. Glad the chief did in single quotes memes followed, as they always did. A still frame of Hayes sitting with his cap in his lap, eyes shadowed beneath the brim, was captioned. Strongest man in the room never raised his voice. Another showed Daniel's empty chest, the space where the badge had been, stamped with the words, authority lost, respect never had. But not all voices were in harmony. Police unions weighed in, their statements clipped and defensive. Due process must be respected. One read. No officer should be stripped of his badge without review. Yet even as those words hit the air, they were drowned beneath the tide of public sentiment. For once, the crowd was not divided. They had witnessed the scene themselves. They had seen the veteran's silence, the chief's decision, the officer's disgrace. No statement could erase what had been recorded. Hollis watched from his office as networks played the footage in endless rotation. He heard analysts dissect his decision, some calling it bold, others reckless. He didn't care for their verdicts. He knew the one that mattered had already been given. Written in the eyes of the people on Jefferson Avenue, etched in the silence that had steadied the crowd. And William Hayes. He knew none of this as he walked further from the street where it began. He didn't see the headlines, didn't scroll the feeds, didn't hear strangers on the other side of the country typing his name into search bars. He only knew the weight of his duffel, the sound of his boots on wet pavement, and the quiet that he carried like a shield. Yet he had become a symbol, whether he wanted it or not. The echoes of his silence traveled faster than he could walk, louder than any voice raised. In anger, by the time dawn would break again, his stillness would be stitched into the fabric of a city, a nation, a narrative that had already outgrown him. On Jefferson Avenue, the bench remained empty. Online, it had become an altar. By morning, the story had already become something larger than Jefferson Avenue. Newspapers carried it above the fold. News anchors spoke about it with practiced gravitas. And social feeds hummed with anger, pride, and fascination. William Hayes was everywhere not by choice, but by force of narrative. His silence had been translated into hashtags, his stillness into headlines. Yet even as the public rallied behind him, another force stirred. Quieter but equally determined. The police union. At the union's downtown office, the blinds were drawn, and the air inside carried the bitter tang of burnt coffee and restless tempers. A dozen men and women sat around a long table, some in suits, others in uniform. Papers were scattered across the surface, printed screenshots of headlines, transcriptions of social media posts, stills of Chief Hollis standing face-to-face with Daniels. The badge mid-removal gleamed on half the screens. The union president, a broad man with thinning hair named Callahan, slammed his palm against the table. He humiliated one of ours in the street, in front of cameras. That's not justice. That's a circus. Murmurs rippled around the room. Some nodded grimly. Others shifted uncomfortably, glancing at the images. They knew the footage was damning. They knew the crowd had already passed judgment. But loyalty ran deep, and the union was built on loyalty above all. "Public's eating this up," one officer muttered. "Chief looks like a hero. Daniels looks like a fool. And us? We look weak, like we can't protect our own." Callahan jabbed a finger at the photo of Hayes. "And this veteran, what's he done? Sat there, didn't say a word. Now the city's ready to crown him a saint and throw one of ours to the wolves." A younger representative spoke up hesitantly. "With respect, he didn't have to say a word. That's the point. Daniels mocked him, and the man just endured. People saw that. They're not siding with us this time. They won't." Callahan's jaw tightened. "Then we remind them why unions exist. We remind them that every officer deserves due process. We say this was rushed, reckless." Hollis went outside protocol. "We make it about procedure, not about optics. You hear me? Procedure." Nods circled the table again, though slower this time. The words sounded hollow against the weight of public outrage, but it was the only shield they had left. By noon, the statement was drafted. It hit inboxes and news feeds like a stone dropped into water. "The union stands firm in support of due process for Officer Daniels. While we respect the chief's intent, we cannot condone public discipline carried out without review. All officers are entitled to the protections of procedure, regardless of circumstance. The events on Jefferson Avenue represent a breakdown in protocol, and we will pursue this matter vigorously." The city reacted instantly. News outlets read the statement with raised brows. Analysts dissected its language, and social media erupted. Some scoffed at it outright. Due process. We all saw what happened. Others nodded cautiously, wary of celebrating accountability too soon. But the loudest voices belonged to those who had been on Jefferson Avenue or who felt they had, through the glow of their screens. "No procedure needed. We saw the truth. You don't need a hearing when the evidence is already viral." Protecting their own. Again, Chief Hollis read the statement in his office. His jaw set tight. He knew it was coming. The union always pushed back. But this time, the tide was different. This time, the public had seen too much. And in a shelter across town, unaware of the words swirling in his name, William Hayes sat quietly with a paper cup of coffee, the duffel bag at his feet. He had not asked to be a symbol. But symbols were not chosen, they were made. And his silence had made him one. The union could push. The city could resist. But the truth of Jefferson Avenue was already out. Etched in footage that could not be erased. City Hall loomed over the square like a stone sentinel. Its steps darkened by the morning's rain, its flag snapping crisply in the wind. By the time Chief Hollis climbed those steps, his name and face were already circling every newsroom in the state. He knew why he had been summoned. He could feel the urgency in the clipped tone of the mayor's aide who had called at dawn. The city wasn't just talking anymore. It was demanding. Inside. The building hummed with its own kind of electricity. Aides carrying files stacked high. Interns tapping at laptops. Phones ringing in unbroken cycles. At the far end of the hallway, double oak doors stood ajar, and voices spilled through, sharp with debate. Hollis adjusted his collar, squared his shoulders, and stepped inside. Mayor Catherine Duval sat at the head of a long conference table, her posture rigid, her eyes sharp beneath the fluorescent light. Around her, advisors clustered like wary birds, murmuring over polling data, community statements, and screenshots of hashtags that had surged overnight. #RespectHayes was already trending nationwide. "Chief," Duval said, gesturing him closer. Her voice carried the calm authority of a woman used to commanding both a room and a city. "You've made us the lead story in every outlet across the country." Hollis met her gaze steadily. I did what needed to be done. That may be, she replied, her tone clipped. But you did it in front of half the city, and the other half has already seen it online. That's not a decision. It's a spectacle. Now we have to manage the aftermath. An advisor slid a tablet across the table. Hollis glanced down. The screen was filled with side-by-side images. William Hayes, sitting steady in silence, and Officer Daniels, red-faced and stripped of his badge. The contrast was damning. Public opinion is with the veteran, the advisor said. And with you for now. But the union's statement has stirred doubt. They're pushing this narrative of due process denied. Some people are listening. Hollis exhaled slowly. I didn't deny him due process. I enforced discipline. In the moment it was required. That officer disgraced his uniform, and the entire street witnessed it. Mayor Duval leaned forward, her eyes narrowing. And what happens if Daniels sues? What happens when the union rallies? You've cracked open a fight that isn't just about him, Chief. It's about the department's entire image. Her words weren't hostile, but heavy with caution. The room went quiet, save for the rustle of papers and the muted ring of a phone. Someone hurried to silence. Finally, Duval sighed, folding her hands on the table. Here's the truth. The city can't afford to look like it protects arrogance over honor. People saw that veteran. They saw what he endured. They won't forgive us if we bury this in hearings and paperwork. But we also can't afford to let the union turn this into a crusade. We need balance. Hollis nodded once. What do you want from me? A statement, she said firmly. Not just about Daniels. About the values this department stands for. About respect for veterans, for service animals, for the people we're sworn to protect. You'll stand with me when I deliver. It will make this clear. The city won't tolerate disrespect, no matter the badge. The chief considered it. He thought of Hayes' silence, the weight it carried. He thought of Daniels in that empty room, stripped of everything but bitterness. And he thought of the crowd, their faces lit by phones, their judgment swift and unwavering. Yes, he said finally. It's the only way forward. Mayor Duval leaned back, satisfied. Good. Then we turn this from scandal into statement. And pray the union doesn't push harder. Outside, the bells of City Hall struck noon, their echoes ringing across the square. The city was listening. The city was watching. And now, it was waiting. William Hayes had not sought out the headlines. But by the following morning, they found him anyway. He had spent the night in a cot at the veterans' shelter, his duffel tucked neatly beneath him. His cap hung from the edge of the metal frame. The room was quiet, but not silent. The low hum of breathing from other men. The occasional cough. The shuffle of blankets. It was a familiar soundscape, one he had grown used to over years of drifting through places that offered beds to those who had none. He woke early, as he always did, long before the sun fully climbed the horizon. Routine was his anchor. Rise, wash, fold the blanket, check the bag, and step outside into whatever weather the day carried. But this morning, as he laced his boots, the shelter's television flickered with muted urgency. A news anchor's voice spilled into the room, sharp and steady. The homeless veteran whose quiet strength on Jefferson Avenue has become the focus of national attention. Hayes froze. His fingers hovered over the laces. He glanced at the screen. There he was, his own figure, small and still, sitting on that bench as Officer Daniels loomed over him. The footage looped, then cut to the chief removing the badge, then to the crowd. Phones raised like lanterns in the rain. The room stirred, as others noticed. One of the younger vets, a wiry man named Lewis, whistled softly. That's you, Bill. You're all over the place. Look at that hero of the city. Hayes said nothing. He tugged the laces tight and stood, his shoulders stiff. He wanted to look away, but the anchor's words clung to him. Silent hero, symbol of dignity. Veteran mocked, officer disgraced. Labels, all of them. Words meant for headlines, not for truth. At the breakfast line downstairs, volunteers ladled oatmeal into paper bowls, their chatter subdued. But even there, whispers followed him. A woman with tired eyes and flour on her apron offered an extra slice of bread with his bowl. Saw you on the news, she said softly. What you did it meant something. Thank you. He nodded once, forcing a polite half smile, and carried his tray to the corner. But the attention followed him. A man across the table leaned forward, eager. You gonna speak to reporters? People want to hear your story. Might do you some good. Hayes shook his head. Not my kind of fight. But the world was pulling him into it, whether he wanted it or not. By midday, a local journalist found her way to the shelter. Her notepad clutched tight, her questions spilling faster than he could deflect. "Mr. Hayes, can you tell us what was going through your mind? Do you feel justice was served? What does this mean for veterans like you?" He answered the only way he knew how: it's silence. He rose, took his bag, and stepped outside into the cold air. The rain had stopped, leaving the streets damp and shining. He walked slowly, his boots steady against the pavement, each step a way to put distance between himself and the noise. Yet, even as he walked, fragments reached him, snatches of conversation from open shop doors, the glow of screens in cafe windows, the words carried in whispers by strangers who glanced at him as he passed. That's him. That's the veteran. Hayes felt the weight of it pressing on his chest. He hadn't asked for a stage. He hadn't wanted to be a symbol. He wanted quiet. A cot, a meal, a street that didn't demand more from him than he had left to give. But symbols weren't born by choice. They were made by moments, and his silence had become one. That evening, back at the shelter, a boy no older than 10 approached him with wide, earnest eyes. "Mister," the boy whispered, clutching a folded newspaper, "my dad's a vet too. He says you showed people what real strength is." For the first time that day, Hayes let himself meet the child's gaze. He managed a small nod, his voice quiet but steady. "Your dad already knows what that is." The boy smiled, clutching the paper tighter. Hayes turned away, his heart heavy. He could not run from the noise. It had already found him. The rain had cleared by the third morning, leaving Jefferson Avenue bright and sharp beneath the pale sun. The city was stirring, as it always did, delivery trucks rumbling to curbs, shopkeepers sweeping their stoops, the bakery letting out its first warm gust of bread-scented air. To a passerby, it looked ordinary again. Yet the street carried residue, like ash after a fire. People still slowed as they crossed the block, their eyes flicking toward the weathered bench that had become the unlikely stage for the city's reckoning. The bench sat empty, but not forgotten. Someone had laid a small bouquet of daisies across its splintered wood. A folded newspaper rested beside them, its front page showing the frozen frame that had now become iconic. William Hayes, seated in silence, Officer Daniels looming above, and Chief Hollis reaching for the badge. The caption beneath read simply, "Dignity in the storm." Chief Hollis returned to that spot just after sunrise. He walked without escort, his uniform pressed, his cap tucked under his arm. The city had already shifted to the next crisis. Merrill statements, union protests, media panels dissecting every angle. But Hollis knew that for himself. The heart of it was here, on this quiet stretch of sidewalk. He stopped before the bench, staring down at the flowers and the folded newsprint. His hand drifted absently to his pocket, where the badge he had taken still rested. Heavy and metallic, cool against the fabric. He sat. The bench creaked under his weight, the same sound it had made under Hayes days earlier. Hollis placed the badge on the wood beside the daisies, its gold catching the morning light. For a long time, he said nothing. He simply let the silence speak, as Hayes had. He thought of Daniels, bitter and broken in that briefing room, of the union, sharpening its teeth, of the mayor, demanding balance between justice and politics. And he thought of Hayes, walking away with nothing but a duffel and his dignity, leaving behind a story bigger than himself. Not long after, Hayes appeared. His steps were steady, measured as always, his duffel slung across his shoulder. He hadn't planned to return here, but something had pulled him back, perhaps curiosity, perhaps closure, perhaps nothing more than the instinct to face a place that had changed the course of his days. He stopped when he saw Hollis seated there, the badge glinting on the bench. For a moment, neither man spoke. The city moved around them. A child laughed, a bus sighed to a stop, the bakery bell jingled as a door swung open. Yet in that small circle of sidewalk, the world held still. Hollis gestured to the badge. "This doesn't belong to him anymore. But it doesn't belong to me either. Feels like it belongs here where respect was tested and found." Hayes' gray eyes lingered on the metal, then on the chief. His expression didn't change much. Smile, no scowl, just the quiet gravity of a man who had seen more than most could bear. "Badges don't make respect," he said finally, his voice low, steady. "Actions do." Hollis nodded, his throat tight. "You taught this city that." Without saying a word, Hayes lowered himself onto the other end of the bench. The two men sat in silence, side by side, watching the street wake. No cameras, no crowd, no spectacle, just the ordinary hum of life layered over a memory that would not fade. Eventually, Hayes stood again, He adjusted the duffel, tipped his cap slightly, and walked on, his boots steady against the pavement. Hollis remained seated, the badge still gleaming on the wood. By mid-morning, the bench would draw other curious strangers, grateful veterans, mothers with children, who wanted to see where it had happened. They would find the flowers, the newspaper, and the badge lying there like an artifact. Some would call it a shrine, others, a reminder. For Hayes, it was neither. It was simply a bench he had once sat on, steady in a storm. And that was enough.